The story begins where the fog never truly lifts. The Appalachian Mountains of western Virginia rise like great sleeping beasts, their ridges folding into one, another beneath a sky the color of iron. In the year 1883, these lands were wild, raw, and slow to forget. The people who lived there knew every echo that rolled through the hollows, every church bell, every scream that was never answered. Among them was a young woman whose name, for decades, would be spoken only in whispers. Mara Dillard, 22 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, a creature of both grace and calculation. Her story would stain the quiet valleys that raised her, and even now, old families in the hills still say that some names carry a chill when spoken aloud. Mara had been born in a clapboard house near the small township of Ashevale Hollow, a place hemmed in by pine forests and cold creeks that shone like silver wires in the moonlight. Her father died young, crushed beneath a mule cart, leaving her mother to raise 3 children, through the leanest years the region had ever known. Neighbors remembered Mara as polite but distant, a girl who watched rather than joined, who smiled with her lips but never her eyes. By the time she turned 19, she had already left home to work as a domestic in the house of a prosperous farmer. Within months, that farmer would vanish. At first, no one dared connect the dots. Disappearances were not uncommon in the mountains. Men wandered off after debt, drink, or despair. But the pattern would return again and again, each time circling back to Mara Dillard. In the winter of 1882, she appeared at a dance in Monroe Valley, wearing a pale blue dress she could not possibly have afforded. Witnesses remembered how the lamplight caught the sheen of her hair, how her laughter seemed to fill the room with something dangerous and inviting. Among those watching was Samuel Herrick, a widowed cattle owner twice her age, whose modest wealth and loneliness made him an easy mark. Within weeks, he was bewitched. Within months, he was gone. The first official record of Mara's name appears in the Greenvale County Register on March 11, 1883, the day she came to the sheriff's office in tears. Her husband, she claimed, had left before dawn to check animal traps in the woods and never returned. She spoke with trembling sincerity, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with the initials. MD Sheriff James Whitmore, a former Union Army sergeant, listened carefully as she described how the fog had rolled in that morning, how she had called for Samuel until her voice gave out. The sheriff believed little and trusted less. Search parties scoured the ridges for nearly 2 weeks. They found broken branches, a torn scrap of coat, and the remains of an old snare rusted with years of neglect, but no body. Not even footprints survived in the half-frozen mud. The men came home exhausted and uneasy. Samuel Herrick, they concluded, had vanished into the mountain mist. Meanwhile, Mara remained on the farm, dressing in mourning black and speaking softly of her loss. Her beauty, magnified by grief, drew sympathy from neighbors and suitors alike. Only Sheriff Whitmore seemed unmoved. When he reviewed the county records, he discovered that 3 weeks before Samuel's disappearance, the entire farm had been transferred to Mara's name. A legal deed, perfectly written, witnessed by 2 men now conveniently traveling out of state. He began to watch her from a distance. Sometimes he saw her riding alone at dusk, following narrow trails that led toward the deeper valleys, places where few locals ever went. Other times she was seen in town, speaking quietly to a man later identified as William Thorne, a merchant from the neighboring county. Less than 6 months after Samuel's disappearance, the widow of Greenvale had become engaged again. Rumor turned to dread when a letter arrived anonymously on Sheriff Whitmore's desk. It warned that this new fiancé would join the others beneath. "The pines if he does not beware." The handwriting was crude, the tone desperate. Whether born of gossip or guilt, it was enough to reopen the investigation and to set in motion the unraveling of Mara Dillard's dark legend. Sheriff James Whitmore was a man of reason in a land ruled by superstition. He had seen what desperation could make people do. Farmers shooting neighbors over fence lines, lovers disappearing into the river after a night of whiskey and betrayal. But something about Mara Dillard unsettled him in a way no ghost story ever could. He began to gather quiet testimony. He spoke to the blacksmith who had forged the Herrick cattle brands, to the dressmaker who had fitted Mara's morning gown, and to the stable boy who swore he'd seen her riding toward the foothills long after midnight. The stories came together like twigs feeding the same fire. One night, the boy said, he'd followed her from a distance, curious. She'd carried something heavy slung over her saddle, a rope, maybe a tarp, and vanished beyond a line of dead trees that marked the edge of Hollow Ridge Ravine. When she returned an hour later, her dress was streaked with mud. She had not seen him watching. Whitmore ordered his men to ride out quietly the next morning. The ravine lay a mile past the last homestead, where the earth sank into a steep cleft filled with dark water and jagged rock. It was the kind of place no man would go unless he had a reason, or something to hide. The sheriff's boots crunched, over frost and brittle, leaves as he studied the ground. There were faint drag marks leading toward the edge, half erased by recent rain. He crouched, touched the earth, and felt the cold seep through his fingers. Still, there was nothing that could be presented in a courtroom. No body, no witness, just suspicions whispered by wind and instinct. Whitmore had learned that in Appalachia, truth had to be dug for like coal. So he waited, patient as the mountain itself. Spring in the mountains came late that year. The trees along the valley floor were still bare, their black branches etched against a gray sky. Sheriff Whitmore rode the same narrow roads every day, waiting for Mara Dillard to make her next move. He didn't have the luxury of proof, only a growing sense that the pattern would repeat, that another man would vanish before the year was done. The merchant, William Thorne, was everything Samuel Herrick had been, older, widowed, well-off, and eager for affection. He was known in Uniontown for his mild temperament and his generosity. Mara met him at a church gathering that winter. Within a month, she was seen walking arm in arm with him through the square, her black mourning clothes replaced by soft lavender and pale lace. Whitmore's deputy, a young man named Harlan Pike, kept eyes on her whenever she visited town. She was careful, polite, perfectly measured in public. But there was something cold about her grace, something practiced. When Thorne introduced her as his bride-to-be, Pike swore he saw her expression flicker, just a fraction, the ghost of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. By April, the engagement was official, and by May, Mara had begun visiting Thorne's store in the evenings, bringing him food, staying long after the lamps were extinguished. Neighbors whispered, but no one dared speak ill of a grieving woman trying to rebuild her life. It was around this time that the first letter reached the Union Marshal. It came without a signature, written in trembling script. Another man is about to vanish. Stop her before she makes the ground take him too. The marshal dismissed it as nonsense until he noticed something curious, a name scribbled faintly on the back of the paper, almost an afterthought, Herrick. He sent the letter to Greenvale, where Whitmore received it 3 days later. The sheriff didn't hesitate. He packed a small satchel, mounted his horse, and rode out before dawn. Uniontown was smaller than Greenvale, its main street little more than a row of wood-framed shops and a church steeple that leaned ever so slightly. Whitmore arrived unannounced and made his way to Thorne's store, where he found the merchant balancing his accounts. Thorne recognized him instantly. "You're the sheriff from Greenvale, aren't you?" he asked. "About that poor man who went missing, the widow's late husband?" Whitmore nodded. "That's right. I've reason to believe she's planning to remarry." Thorne laughed softly, though uneasily. "She's a fine woman, Sheriff. You'll find no villainy in her. The tragedy has passed, and she's only trying to live again." The sheriff studied the man's face. "You know she inherited her husband's property after he disappeared?" Thorne hesitated, his fingers tightening around the ledger. "She told me as much. Said it was all handled legally." Whitmore reached into his coat and unfolded a document, the deed transferring Samuel Herrick's land to Mara's name, dated 3 weeks before the man vanished. It was, he said, just as the one before it. Thomas Beck, White Hollow Springs, 1880. His property, too, signed over before he disappeared. Thorne's eyes widened. 2 husbands? 3, Whitmore corrected quietly. There was one before both of them. Pocahontas County, 1879, name was Jacob. Winters, lumberman, never came home from the woods. Nobody found. The color drained from Thorne's face. He sank into his chair, his ledger slipping to the floor. "You're saying she killed them?" "I'm saying every man who's put a ring on her finger has vanished, and every time she's walked away richer than before." Thorne leaned forward, trembling. "You're mistaken. Mara's gentle kind, she couldn't harm anyone. The sheriff's eyes were cold. Then you won't mind if we watch, quietly. That night, Whitmore set 2 deputies to keep watch on Mara's rented house. They took turns through the darkness, noting when she came and went. She was often awake long after midnight, candlelight flickering through the curtains. Once, around 2 in the morning, she stepped outside wearing a shawl and carrying a small lantern. She stood in her yard for nearly 10 minutes, staring toward the ridge. Then she whispered something the deputies couldn't hear and smiled. The following week, Whitmore arranged to meet Thorne again, this time in secret. The merchant looked worn, sleepless, and afraid. "She's begun asking about my property," he said quietly. "How the deed works. Whether my assets would automatically transfer to a spouse." Whitmore nodded grimly. "She'll move soon. We'll let her." Thorne frowned. "Let her? If we stop her now, we have no evidence," Whitmore said. "We need to see what she does next. And when she slips, we'll catch her." The merchant hesitated, torn between fear and obedience. Finally, he nodded. "What do you want me to do?" "Invite her to dinner," the sheriff said. "Make her talk. Let her believe she's already won." 3 nights later, the trap was set. The evening of the dinner was cold and clear, the kind of night when the mountain air carried every sound. Mara arrived just after dusk, wrapped in a green cloak trimmed with silver thread. She greeted Thorne with a tender smile, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She seemed unaware of the men hidden in the adjoining rooms, Sheriff Whitmore among them, listening through the cracks in the door. For the first hour, the conversation was harmless. Wedding plans, church flowers, the weather in Greenvale. Then Thorne steered the talk toward her past, asking softly about her late husband. Mara's expression shifted, her smile fading just slightly. "It isn't kind to speak of the dead, William," she said. "I'd like to understand," he insisted gently. "You've lost so much. How did you bear it?" Her eyes flicked toward the firelight. "You learn to bury what hurts," she murmured. "The earth keeps secrets better than hearts do." Whitmore froze. Her tone was neither grieving nor nostalgic. It was something colder, like satisfaction. Thorne pressed further. "Do you ever think of them? The men who—" Mara interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. "They got what they deserved." Silence fell. Even through the wall, Whitmore felt the temperature in the room drop. Then Mara smiled again, soft and deliberate. "Men," she said, "are predictable creatures. They all have weaknesses. They all dig their own graves. I only make sure they fall in." Whitmore motioned for his men to stay still. He wanted her to keep talking. "Tell me, Mara," Thorne said, his throat dry. "What graves are those?" Her eyes glittered. "There's a ravine near Lewis Hollow," she whispered. "Steep, cold, and deep enough to hide everything you wish the world would forget." Whitmore didn't move, but his heart pounded. That was the place. Hollow Ridge. And now, finally, they had something more than rumor. The next morning, Sheriff Whitmore gathered 6 men before sunrise. They rode in silence, the hooves of their horses muffled by the wet soil of early spring. Mist clung to the branches like thin fingers, and the sky above the ridges glowed faintly with the first light. Whitmore didn't speak of where they were going, not until the trail began to narrow, cutting between black stones slick with moss. "We're searching Hollow Ridge," he finally said. "The widow mentioned it last night. She described it like someone who's been there." No one asked why. The men had all heard the whispers, seen the same quiet dread in the sheriff's eyes. Every valley in Appalachia had its own ghost story, but this one was alive. They reached the mouth of the ravine by mid-morning. It was narrower than expected, its edges hidden by a thicket of laurel and wild pine. The air smelled of iron and damp earth. Whitmore dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He studied the ground, shallow grooves, too wide for animal tracks leading toward the edge. "Start there," he said. "Be gentle." The men spread out, moving slowly, probing the ground with long sticks. They worked in silence, the sound of shovels biting into the cold soil echoing off the stone walls. Every so often, Whitmore would pause and look up at the sky, its gray light filtering through the trees like smoke. It was near noon when a deputy called out softly, "Sheriff, here." Whitmore moved quickly, his breath visible in the chill air. The man knelt beside a cluster of rocks where the earth looked freshly disturbed, darker than the soil around it. He brushed the dirt away with his hands until something pale and curved appeared beneath. At first it could have been anything, a root, a stone, but as the layer of earth thinned, the shape became clear. Bone, human bone. Whitmore felt his stomach tighten. "Careful," he whispered. They dug slowly, clearing away clumps of wet soil. One by one, more bones emerged, ribs, fingers, a jaw, the remnants of fabric long rotted into threads. By the time they uncovered the skull, the sheriff no longer needed confirmation. The back of it was caved in, the break too clean, too deliberate. One of the men removed a rusted belt buckle from the mud and turned it in his hand. The initials, faint but visible, read S.H. Whitmore didn't speak for several seconds. Then quietly he said, "Samuel Herrick." They laid out the remains carefully on a tarp, their expressions grim. The mountains around them were silent, the wind still, as though the ridge itself was holding its breath. "This wasn't no accident," one deputy murmured. "No," Whitmore said. "It wasn't." He crouched by the shallow grave, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the hole. The placement was deliberate. The rocks had been arranged to keep animals away, the soil packed tight. Whoever buried Samuel knew what they were doing. They found fragments of rope buried near the neck bones, coarse, frayed, preserved by dampness. That detail would stay with Whitmore long after. They carried the remains back up the trail, the weight of them heavier than any of the men wanted to admit. By the time they reached their horses, the sun was beginning to set, painting the ridge in shades of copper and shadow. On the way back to Greenvale, no one spoke. The mountains loomed around them like silent witnesses. Every man in that group understood the same truth. Mara Dillard's crimes weren't just rumor anymore. Whitmore didn't rest that night. He sat in his office, the bones laid out on the table under the dim light of an oil lamp. His report was brief and deliberate. Remains discovered in Hollow Ridge. Ravine correspond with the description of Samuel Herrick. Fracture to the skull indicates blunt force. Rope found near neck. Death ruled homicide. He folded the paper neatly, sealed it, and stared out the window toward the black outline of the hills. Somewhere out there beneath that same sky, Mara Dillard was sleeping, or pretending to. At dawn, he sent a messenger to Monroe County to alert the marshal. Within hours, word came back. The woman was still in town, busy with her wedding preparations. She had no idea what they had found. Whitmore gathered his men again, this time with a different purpose. He rode through the valley as the first birds began to sing, his coat flapping in the wind, his jaw set. Uniontown was already awake when they arrived. People stopped to stare as the sheriff's party dismounted in front of a modest, two-story house near the edge of town. Curtains fluttered. The smell of baking bread drifted from somewhere nearby. Whitmore approached the door, knocked once, and waited. For a long moment there was silence. Then footsteps descended the stairs, soft and unhurried. The latch turned. Mara Dillard stood in the doorway, wrapped in a gray shawl. Her hair was undone, falling over her shoulders in loose curls. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as though she had been expecting them all along. "Sheriff Whitmore," she said softly. "I was wondering when you'd come." Whitmore's voice was steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Herrick." Mara didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Murder?" she repeated as if tasting the word. "That's a strong accusation." "We found him," Whitmore said. "In the ravine, just where you said he'd be." Her eyes glimmered, something between amusement and relief. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "the mountains have finally told on me." The deputies moved in, binding her wrists. She didn't resist. Instead, she glanced toward the distant ridges, where fog still lingered, and whispered something the sheriff almost didn't catch. "They'll never find the rest." Whitmore frowned. "What rest?" he asked. But Mara only smiled and turned her face toward the dawn. The morning air in Uniontown was brittle and bright. Frost still clung to the grass as the sheriff's party rode through the narrow streets, the prisoner seated straight-backed on her horse, hands tied in front of her. Townsfolk lined the road in stunned silence. No one spoke her name, but everyone knew it. Mara Dillard, the young widow who had lost 3 husbands to the fog, and the earth was now accused of burying them herself. Her expression didn't waver. She sat tall, composed, as though she were attending a Sunday service instead of being escorted to a jail cell. Even Whitmore, hardened by years of seeing men crumble under guilt, felt something unsettling about her calm. He'd seen fear, rage, and denial in criminals before, but never serenity. When they reached Greenvale, she stepped down from the horse without assistance and looked up at the sheriff. "Will you allow me a proper dress before you lock me away?" she asked. Whitmore studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Make it quick." She changed into a dark wool gown, simple but spotless. Her wrists were bound again, and she was led into the small stone, holding room beneath the sheriff's office, a single window no bigger than a Bible, its bars rusted by years of damp. The walls were cold, the air still. Whitmore ordered 2 guards to keep watch at all hours. "She's not to speak to anyone without permission," he said. "Not the preacher, not the maids, no one?" When the cell door closed, Mara finally looked around. Her gaze lingered on the walls, then on the sheriff. "You'll find I'm a polite prisoner," she said softly. "But I do hope your conscience is clean before you decide what I am." Whitmore ignored the bait. "You'll have your chance to speak," he said. He returned hours later with Nathaniel Griggs, the county prosecutor, a tall man with spectacles and a patience that bordered on cruelty. They set up a small table between them, the sheriff's notes and the belt buckle found in hollow, Ridge laid out in plain sight. "Mrs. Dillard," Griggs began, his tone measured, "you understand why you're here." Mara folded her hands neatly. "You believe I killed my husband." "We don't believe," the prosecutor replied. "We have evidence." She glanced at the buckle, her expression unreadable. "That old thing proves nothing. The mountains keep bones the way the sea keeps secrets." Whitmore leaned forward. "We found more than bones, rope, the skull fractured. Not a fall, not a wild animal. You did this." Mara met his eyes without blinking. "You've never been a wife, Sheriff. You don't know what men are capable of when no one's watching." Griggs tilted his head. "Are you suggesting Samuel Herrick was abusive?" Her lips twitched. "I'm suggesting Samuel Herrick was a man. That's often enough." She spoke in riddles, her tone so even that it was impossible to tell whether she was mocking them or confessing in her own way. The sheriff let her talk, watching every flicker of her expression. "I buried no one," she said finally. "I merely left what the earth demanded to take." The prosecutor exchanged a glance with Whitmore. "You realize that's an admission?" "Only if you're eager to hear it that way." Whitmore rose abruptly, his patience thinning. "You're young, Mara," he said. "You could spare yourself the rope if you tell us the truth. Tell me where the others are. Thomas Beck, Jacob Winters." "We'll see the judge gives mercy." For the first time, her calm cracked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mercy," she repeated. "Do you think the earth gives mercy, Sheriff? Do you think the mountain lets go once it has something it wants?" Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. "I don't remember where Thomas lies. I buried him at night." The snow fell heavy. "The others?" She paused, looking past them, as though seeing something no one else could. "The others went deeper." "Deeper where?" Griggs demanded. She didn't answer. Whitmore slammed his palm on the table. "You'll tell us before this is done." Mara smiled faintly. "If you dig long enough, you'll find what you're meant to. But I warn you, Sheriff, some graves aren't meant to be opened." The prosecutor gathered his papers with visible irritation. "We'll continue this tomorrow," he said. When they left the room, Whitmore turned to him. "She's playing us." Griggs nodded grimly. "Then let's play back." That night, Whitmore sent word to the search parties in both White Hollow Springs and Pocahontas County. He told them to dig near the old Beck farm and the forest around Jacob Winters' cabin. He didn't sleep, not even when the lamps burned low. In his mind, he could still hear her voice, smooth, unshaken, almost pitying, as she said. The others went deeper. 3 days passed before word came down from the mountains. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse mud-caked and trembling from the ride. Sheriff Whitmore opened the sealed note in silence, the faint smell of rain still clinging to the parchment. Inside were only 6 words scrawled in haste. "Found him. White Hollow Springs, same." He didn't need more. By mid-morning, the sheriff and his deputies were riding hard toward the old Beck property. The road curved sharply through fields left fallow since the farm's sale, the house itself now a collapsing ruin surrounded by wild brambles. The men dismounted. the sound of their boots crunching over dead leaves. A deputy led them to a spot behind the barn where the earth had been disturbed. A shallow grave, marked only by a single piece of wood driven into the soil, splintered with age. Whitmore knelt beside it. How deep? Not more than 4 feet, came the reply. We found bone fragments already. They dug carefully, and by the time the sun reached its highest point, the truth was unearthed once more. A skeleton, stripped clean by time but unmistakably human. Alongside it, the rusted head of a hammer, still slick with iron stains that would never fade. Whitmore said nothing. He only stared down at the pit. The same pattern, the same precision. Every act planned and executed as neatly as her forged signatures. He stood, brushing the dirt from his gloves. Bag everything. We take it to Greenvale. When they returned that evening, Mara was waiting. She sat on the edge of her cot, her posture impeccable despite the chains at her wrists. She looked up as Whitmore entered, her lips curving into the faintest hint of amusement. You found him, she said before he could speak. Whitmore froze. How do you... She shrugged lightly. You're predictable, Sheriff. You dig where I've already mourned. He stepped closer to the bars. You call that mourning? You buried him like a dog. Her gaze sharpened. Better a grave than what he deserved. Thomas Beck? She nodded once, almost reverently. He drank until his hands shook. Then he'd take it out on me. Words, sometimes fists. I learned early that a man's love turns mean after sundown. Whitmore's voice softened despite himself. So you killed him. I ended something that had already begun dying, she replied simply. The mountain only helped me hide it. He stared at her in silence, unable to tell whether she was justifying or confessing. Her tone never rose, never broke. It was as though she were recounting someone else's life entirely. The sheriff pulled from his coat a folded document, the report from the excavation site. We found a hammer, he said quietly. The handle's gone, but the head, it fits the wound. Her eyes flicked toward it, then back to his face. Then I suppose you'll hang me for it. Whitmore hesitated. You don't seem afraid. Mara tilted her head slightly. What good does fear do the condemned? The rope waits either way. He wanted to shake her, to break through whatever wall she had built around herself. Instead, he turned and left, the echo of her calm voice following him up the narrow stairway. That night, Whitmore met with the prosecutor and the county judge. The evidence from Hollow Ridge and White. Hollow was enough to indict her for both murders. The third, Jacob Winters, was still only rumor, but the sheriff knew in his gut it was real. He'd seen the precision of her pattern. He'd seen her eyes. When the hearing was held 2 days later, the courthouse overflowed. Farmers, preachers, widows, even children crowded the wooden benches, drawn by the scent of blood and mystery. Mara Dillard was led inside under heavy guard, her wrists bound but her chin high. She looked every inch the grieving widow, not the killer the papers were already calling the Bride of Hollow Ridge. The prosecutor rose first. Mrs. Dillard, he said, his voice echoing through the room. You stand accused of murdering your husband, Samuel Herrick, and your previous spouse. Thomas Beck, how do you plead? She didn't hesitate. I don't plead, she said softly. I confess nothing and deny nothing. What happened in those mountains belongs to the mountains. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor pressed on, presenting the evidence, the bones, the buckle, the hammer. Each piece landed like a hammer strike in the silent room. When Whitmore was called to the stand, his words were measured and heavy. She knew where the bodies were before we did, he said. She spoke of them as if she'd already buried them twice, once in the ground, and once in her mind. When it was her turn to speak, Mara stood slowly, her chains rattling softly in the hushed room. You all see me as a monster, she said, her voice clear and steady. But what would you have done, living the life I lived? A woman alone, owned by her husband, traded like land, worked like an animal, beaten like one too. The law protects men. The mountain protects me. Her words sent a strange unease through the crowd. Some nodded, others turned away. The judge, an aging man with kind eyes dulled by duty, finally spoke. The law doesn't grant you vengeance, Mrs. Dillard. Then the law never lived in the mountains, she replied. The gavel struck once. Enough! The jury will deliberate. They didn't take long. 2 hours later, the verdict was delivered. guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree. Whitmore watched her closely as the words were read. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, as if she'd been waiting for it all. Along, when the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Only this," she said. "You found 2 graves, but there are 3 more, and not all of them are mine to answer for." The courtroom erupted. Whitmore rose to his feet. "Where?" he demanded. "Where are the others?" But Mara only laughed softly, shaking her head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." The judge struck the gavel again, calling for silence. "The sentence," he declared, "is death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn, the 14th of June. As the guards led her away, Whitmore felt the chill of her words sinking deep into his bones. 3 more graves. And somewhere out there, the mountains waited. Night came heavy and long over Greenvale. The courthouse emptied slowly, leaving only echoes of murmured disbelief behind its thick wooden doors. Outside, the crowd had gathered beneath the pale moonlight, voices weaving through the air, half awe, half dread. Everyone had come to see the woman who smiled at her own death sentence. Inside, Sheriff Whitmore sat at his desk, the lamplight trembling against the walls as though it too were afraid. The papers before him were signed and sealed. The verdict was final. Mara Dillard would hang in 3 days. He should have felt triumph. For months he had hunted her, chasing shadows, through fog and superstition, until the truth finally bled through. But now that justice was so close, a strange unease took root in his chest. It wasn't doubt, he knew what she had done. It was something else, something colder, the feeling that the story wasn't finished. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, the glass rattling against the table, and read again through the transcript of her trial. Her words replayed in his mind. "You've found 2 graves, but there are 3 more. 3 more. He'd dismissed it at first as the last cruelty of a condemned mind, one last attempt to mock the living. But the tone she'd used hadn't been taunting. It had been certain. He looked up as a knock came at the door. Deputy Pike stepped in, his hat in hand, eyes wide and uncertain. "Sheriff," he said, "you might want to come down to her cell." Whitmore set the glass aside and stood. "What's happened?" "She's talking again, sir. To someone." "To who?" The deputy hesitated. "To herself, maybe. Or," he swallowed, "it sounds like she's talking to the mountain." The sheriff frowned but said nothing. He followed the deputy down the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The oil lamps flickered low, their flames fighting the damp. From the end of the corridor came a soft voice, low and rhythmic like prayer or memory. Mara sat on the edge of her cot, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the chains at her wrists clinking softly with each movement. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring past the wall as though she could see something no one else could. "Mrs. Dillard," Whitmore said quietly. She didn't look up. "The wind carries their names," she murmured. "It's louder here, you know. The closer you are to the ground, the clearer you can hear them." The sheriff stepped closer. "Who are you talking about?" "The ones you'll never find," she said. "The ones who never had graves at all." Whitmore's brow furrowed. "You told us there were 3 more. What did you mean by that?" At last, she looked at him, her gaze steady and unblinking. "Not every man I buried was my husband." For a heartbeat, the sheriff didn't speak. "Explain." Mara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You think you're the first to come for me, Sheriff? The first to ask questions I couldn't afford to answer. Men have been digging around my life for years. Lawmen, debtors, cowards who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The mountains swallowed them too." Whitmore felt a chill rise from the base of his spine. "You're saying there were others, strangers?" She tilted her head slightly. "Strangers at first. Not by the end." The deputy crossed himself quietly, stepping back. Whitmore held her gaze. "You're confessing to more murders?" "I'm confessing to survival," she said softly. "You dress it up however makes you sleep at night." She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. "It's funny, isn't it? You all think you caught me because I slipped. But the truth is I stopped hiding. I wanted you to find them. I wanted someone to know the kind of world a woman has to live in before she decides to make her own." The room was silent except for the faint creak of the ceiling beams. "You'll hang," Whitmore said finally. "At dawn." I know, she said, but it won't change what the mountain remembers. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him one last time. Sheriff. He paused in the doorway. When the wind shifts, she said, her tone almost tender, listen close. You'll hear their names. They don't rest easy. The men who thought they could bury me. Whitmore didn't answer. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the night had deepened. The fog was rolling in again, thick and pale beneath the moonlight. It crept through the streets, up the courthouse steps, through the iron bars of the jail window. The mountain was breathing. That same night, as the sheriff sat at his desk trying to put his thoughts into words, a rider came hard down the road from Pocahontas County. His horse lathered with sweat. He shouted before even dismounting. Sheriff, we found something, down by the creek near Jacob Winter's cabin. Whitmore was already on his feet. Another grave? The man nodded, panting. A body, sir, buried deep. And he hesitated. There's another beside it. Another? Yes, sir. But this one's smaller. A woman's. Whitmore froze. His throat went dry. You're sure? Positive, sir. And she's been there for years. The sheriff's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned toward the staircase that led down to Mara's cell, his boots striking the floor like drum beats. When he reached the bottom, she was standing by the window, the fog outside glowing faintly around her. You already know, don't you? He asked. Mara smiled without turning. I told you, she said softly. The mountain doesn't keep secrets. It keeps balance. Whitmore took a step closer. Who is she? The woman they found? Mara's fingers brushed the iron bars, her voice dropping to a whisper. The one who came before me. The one they thought they buried for good. She turned then, her eyes shining in the lamplight. Jacob Winters didn't just vanish, Sheriff. He made sure no one ever found what he did to her. Until I came along. Whitmore stared, his heart hammering. And what did you do? He asked. Mara's smile faded. I showed him the same mercy he showed her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The truth hung between them like fog, cold, heavy, and undeniable. Whitmore finally nodded once, quietly. You'll still hang. I know, she said again, her voice soft but certain. But at least now someone else will finally be buried beside me. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. The wind carried the sound through the valley like a sigh. And for the first time since her arrest, Sheriff Whitmore felt that Mara Dillard might have been telling the truth all along. The morning before the hanging came with a sky the color of old iron. Storm. Clouds gathered low over the ridges, and the wind howled through the pines like a morning hymn. The people of Greenvale woke early, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Men left their fields untended. Women wrapped shawls tight against the chill. Even children clung to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. By mid-morning, the square was crowded. The gallows stood in the center like a black skeleton, built overnight by the same men who now stood silent before it. A rope hung coiled and still in the damp air, waiting. Inside the jailhouse, Sheriff Whitmore stood at the door of Mara Dillard's cell. She was already awake, seated neatly on her cot, her dark hair braided down her back. She looked almost peaceful. The faint light from the narrow window painted her face in shades of gray and gold. Do you want a priest? He asked. She shook her head. The mountain will hear me just fine. He nodded once. You have 1 hour. As he turned to go, her voice stopped him. Sheriff, she said softly, when they put that rope around my neck, will you look away? He met her eyes. No. Good, she whispered. Then you'll know I didn't lie. Whitmore left her alone after that. Outside, the storm gathered strength, thunder rumbling low against the horizon. He could see the crowd forming, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. The press from Charleston had arrived too, their ink-stained fingers ready to turn her death into tomorrow's headline. The Appalachian widow meets the rope. By 11, the judge, the prosecutor, and the warden had assembled. The sheriff walked down to the cell one last time. It's time, he said quietly. She rose without a word. The deputy fastened the irons around her wrists, and together they led her up the narrow stairs, each step groaning underfoot. When they reached the door, the light struck her face fully for the first time. She didn't flinch. As she stepped outside, a gust of wind tore through the square, carrying with it a cold drizzle. The crowd fell silent. All eyes turned toward the young woman walking through the mud, her gown clinging to her ankles. She climbed the steps of the gallows slowly, with the poise of someone walking into a church. When she reached the platform, she looked out across the valley, the same valley that had taken her husband's, her freedom, and soon her life. The judge read the sentence aloud, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. Mara Dillard, you have been found guilty of the murders of Thomas Beck and Samuel Herrick. You have shown no remorse for your actions. The court sentences you to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. When he finished, a murmur moved through the crowd. Some whispered prayers. Others watched with cold fascination. Whitmore stepped forward to adjust the noose. His hands were steady, though his heart was not. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him. "Do you have any last words?" he asked quietly. Mara's lips parted, her voice soft, but clear enough for all to hear. "You've buried your proof," she said, "but not the truth." A ripple went through the onlookers, but she wasn't finished. "You think the mountain belongs to you, that it will forget me once I'm gone. It won't. It remembers everything. The blood, the lies, the bones you didn't dig deep enough to find." Thunder cracked above them, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she turned her eyes to Whitmore. "When the next body turns up, Sheriff, you remember today. You remember that I warned you." He stared at her, the words chilling him more than the storm ever could. The executioner stepped forward, face hidden beneath his hood. The rope slipped over her neck. She didn't resist. She didn't pray. She only closed her eyes. The trapdoor opened. A gasp rose from the crowd, sharp as the sound of breaking wood. Her body fell, then stilled, swinging slightly in the wind. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the thunder seemed to pause. Sheriff Whitmore waited, his jaw clenched, until the doctor nodded once. "She's gone." He turned away, but her final words clung to him like smoke. "When the next body turns up, Sheriff, you remember today." That night the storm broke. Rain hammered the roof of the jailhouse, flooding the streets and washing over the fresh earth of the graveyard where she'd been laid to rest. The townsfolk crossed themselves when lightning flashed, claiming they saw her silhouette on the hill, a shadow against the storm. Whitmore didn't believe in ghosts, but he didn't sleep either, because deep down he knew what she'd said wasn't a curse. It was a promise. The next morning, a rider came from Monroe Valley soaked and pale, carrying a message for the sheriff. He handed over a crumpled envelope. The writing on the front was faint but unmistakable, for Sheriff Whitmore. Inside was a single line written in the same elegant script he'd seen before. Mara Dillard's. "The mountain's not done yet." Whitmore's hands trembled. He looked up toward the ridge through the fog. Somewhere out there, the earth was waiting to open again. And this time, he feared, it wouldn't be done burying the truth. For 3 days after Mara Dillard's hanging, the town of Greenvale didn't sleep right. The fog returned heavier than before, rolling down from the peaks, like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. People said they could still hear the creak of the rope when the wind passed through the square. Others swore they saw footprints in the mud by her grave. Small, bare, and leading nowhere. Sheriff Whitmore said nothing. He'd buried enough ghosts to know how memory could lie, yet he couldn't escape the thought of her final words. "When the next body turns up, you remember today." By the fourth night, he stopped trying to rest. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping gently on the windows of his office. The air smelled of damp wood and old paper. He sat alone at his desk, the envelope she'd left him lying open before him. The ink had bled from the storm, but the words were still there, "The mountain's not done yet." He was still staring at it when a knock came at the door. "Sheriff?" It was Deputy Pike, his voice low, uneasy. "You might want to see this." Whitmore looked up, weary. "What is it now?" "Messenger from Monroe County," Pike said. "Brought word this afternoon. There's been a discovery out by the old Thorne property." The sheriff frowned. "William Thorne. He's alive." "Not anymore, sir." The words dropped like a stone into water. Whitmore stood, his chair scraping the floor. "When?" "2 days ago," Pike said. "Some kids were fishing near the creek behind his store. Found him there, or what's left of him, half buried under a fallen log. Looked like he'd been dead a week." "That's impossible," Whitmore said quietly. "He was here. He saw her hang." Pike swallowed. That's what makes it strange, sir. Folks say they saw him leave town the night before the execution. Said he looked pale as a ghost. Never came back. The sheriff grabbed his coat and his hat. Saddle up, he ordered. We ride tonight. The road to Monroe County was a narrow ribbon of mud cutting through the dark. The rain had stopped, but the mist hung thick as breath. Whitmore rode at the front, the hooves of his horse muffled against the wet ground. The forest loomed close on either side, black and endless. They reached the Thorne property before dawn. The house was dark, its windows boarded from the inside. Behind it, the creek ran shallow, its banks swollen from the recent storm. And there, half hidden beneath a fallen pine, lay what the messenger had described. The sheriff knelt beside the body. There was no mistaking it. The gray waistcoat, the heavy boots, the merchant's signet ring still clinging to a swollen finger. But the rest was worse than he expected. The flesh was bruised and torn, the skull fractured, the same way Herrick's had been. He turned the corpse over carefully, examining the neck. Rope marks, fresh, deep, unmistakable. Pike stepped closer, his voice trembling. It's the same, Sheriff. Same way, same pattern. Whitmore stared down at the body. The same injuries. The same method. The same careful burial. Except Mara Dillard had been dead for nearly a week. A cold realization began to spread through him like frost. She hadn't been threatening him with ghosts. She'd been warning him about someone still alive. Get the men, he said hoarsely. Search the house. Every room, every inch. The deputies scattered. Whitmore remained by the creek, his mind turning over every word she'd ever said. The mountain keeps balance. Not every grave is mine to answer for. You've buried your proof, not the truth. Inside the house, the men called out for him. Sheriff, you need to see this. He ran inside. The air was thick with mildew and dust. The wallpaper hung in strips, and the smell of rot was stronger here. Pike stood beside the parlor wall where a section of floorboards had been pried up. Under here, the deputy said, his voice low. Whitmore knelt. In the hollow beneath the boards was a box, small, wooden, wrapped in oilcloth. He lifted it carefully, the weight surprising him. When he opened it, the lantern light caught the edge of something metallic inside. He froze. There were 2 wedding rings, a man's pocket watch, engraved WT, and beneath them a photograph, faded, but clear enough to see the faces. William Thorne, smiling beside a woman who wasn't Mara Dillard. The sheriff turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back were 4 words. He got what he gave. Whitmore stared at the image again, heart pounding. The woman beside Thorne had dark eyes and hair the color of coal. Not Mara's face, but familiar. Too familiar. It was Clara Winters, the sister of Jacob. Winters, the man Mara had claimed to have, killed in vengeance for another, woman's death. The threads pulled tight. The circle closed. He rose slowly. It wasn't just her, he said quietly. It never was. Pike frowned. What do you mean, sir? Whitmore turned toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like smoke. There were others, he said. And they're still out there. The deputy crossed himself. You think she had help? Whitmore didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the ridge loomed dark against the first light of dawn. I think, he said finally. Mara Dillard wasn't lying when she said the mountain keeps balance. He tucked the photograph into his coat, feeling the weight of it settle against his heart. Whatever she started, he murmured, it isn't over. Outside, the mist moved through the pines in slow, deliberate waves. Somewhere deep in the valley, a crow called once and was answered by another. By the time the sheriff turned back toward town, the fog had already swallowed the trail behind them, and in the hills above Greenvale, the rain began again, soft, steady, and endless, washing the valley clean of blood that never really disappeared. The ride back to Greenvale was long and silent. Sheriff Whitmore's thoughts churned like the mist that followed them. The photograph, the rings, the watch, all sat heavy in his coat pocket, as though they carried more than just metal and paper. They carried the truth Mara Dillard had tried to speak in riddles. By the time they reached town, dawn had given way to another gray morning. The fog lay thick over the courthouse square, and the gallows, still standing, looked like a ghost of itself. The townsfolk avoided it now, crossing the street rather than pass beneath its shadow. Whitmore dismounted outside the jailhouse and walked straight to his office. Pike followed, closing the door behind them. The sheriff set the photograph on the table, smoothing the edges with his thumb. "That's her," he said quietly. "Clara Winters. Jacob's sister." Pike nodded. "I remember the name. She vanished about a year before Jacob did. Folks thought she'd gone off to Charleston to work, or that she'd run away," Whitmore said. "Now we know better." He looked at the photograph again. The faint smile on Clara's lips, the distance in her eyes. It wasn't joy. It was calculation. "She must have known what her brother did," Whitmore murmured. "What happened to that other woman? Maybe she blamed him for it. Maybe she decided to make things right her own way." Pike frowned. "But, sir, that means—" "It means," Whitmore interrupted, "that Mara Dillard wasn't the only one burying secrets in those hills." He poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, took one bitter sip, and stared out the window. Mara didn't kill Thorne. She couldn't have. But someone wanted us to think she did. Pike swallowed. "Then whoever it was, they're still out there." Whitmore nodded slowly. "And they're not finished." For 2 days, he said nothing to anyone else. The coroner's report on Thorne's body arrived. Strangulation. Bruising consistent with rope compression. Time of death. Late evening, day before Mara Dillard's execution. The timing was perfect. Almost poetic. On the third morning, as Whitmore sat studying his maps of the county, another letter arrived. No messenger this time, just an envelope slipped under his door. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the ink was the same deep brown as Mara's. Inside, a single sentence. "The mountain still owes $2." There was no signature. Whitmore stared at the words, his pulse pounding. He turned the envelope over. No seal, no mark. Just the faint scent of damp pine. Whoever had left it had been close. He stood abruptly, pushing back his chair. "Pike!" he called. The deputy hurried in. "Sir? Find out who's been near this building today. Every stable hand, every courier, every vendor. Someone dropped this off." Pike took the letter, frowning as he read it. "Still owes $2," he murmured. "2 what?" Whitmore's voice was low. "2 more graves." That evening, the rain returned. The sheriff locked his office and walked through the silent streets. He passed the gallows, now slick with rain, and the old church, where candles flickered behind stained glass. Every sound carried too far, the creak of wagon wheels, the soft clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the whisper of wind through trees. He found himself standing at the edge of the cemetery, looking out over the rows of headstones. Mara's grave was unmarked, a simple mound of dirt at the far end. No flowers, no name, just a patch of darker earth. He removed his hat, rain dripping down his face. "You were right," he said quietly. "It's not done." The wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the fence, a branch snapped. Whitmore turned sharply, his hand on his pistol. Nothing, only fog, thick and pale, curling between the trees. But then footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the direction of the ridge. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer, only the steady rhythm of steps through wet leaves. He moved toward the sound, his boots sinking into the mud. The fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Then a shadow appeared, slender, moving slowly along the path that led to the woods. "Stop right there," he barked. The figure froze. Whitmore lifted his lantern, and the light caught a flash of something metallic, a locket, glinting against the chest of a woman. Her hair was dark, her clothes soaked through. He stepped closer, his heart hammering. "Name yourself." The woman turned slightly. Her eyes caught the light, gray, sharp, unblinking. "You don't remember me," she said softly. Her voice was steady, calm. "But I remember you, Sheriff." He squinted. Her face was older now, worn by years, but the resemblance hit him like a strike. He'd seen that face once before, in a photograph. "Clara Winters," he breathed. She nodded once. "You hung the wrong woman." Whitmore took a step back. "You killed Thorne." "I finished what Mara couldn't," Clara said simply. He was part of it, too. They all were. The men? The ones who thought women were theirs to trade, to beat, to bury. Mara was the first to fight back. "I just made sure the last ones joined her." The sheriff's grip tightened on the lantern. "You think this is justice?" Clara's expression didn't change. "No, it's balance." Lightning flashed across the valley, illuminating her face for an instant, and then she was gone. The fog swallowed her as if she'd never been there. Whitmore ran forward, the lantern's flame flickering wildly, but the path was empty. Only footprints remained, leading deeper into the woods. He stood there, breath heavy, until the light began to fade. The rain came harder now, beating against his coat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled through the mountains like a closing door. He looked back once at the cemetery where Mara's grave waited in silence. Then he whispered, "The mountain still owes too, and for the first time in his life, Sheriff." Whitmore wondered if justice had ever truly belonged to him, or if it had always belonged to the land itself. A week after the encounter in the fog, Greenvale returned to a strained silence. The papers had stopped printing Mara Dillard's name, and the gallows had been dismantled, leaving a bare patch of earth in the square where the rain collected in shallow pools. People whispered less now, but the whispers had turned inward. It wasn't fear of what had happened. It was fear of what hadn't ended. Sheriff Whitmore tried to tell himself that Clara Winters had been a ghost born of exhaustion and guilt, nothing more. But the footprints he'd found in the mud, the faint outline of a woman's shoe pressed deep and clear, that was no dream. Someone had stood there in the fog, someone real enough to bleed and vanish. He hadn't reported it. Not to his deputies, not to the judge, not even to Pike. Greenvale had had enough of curses and confessions. There was no sense in adding another specter to the list. But he couldn't stop thinking about her words. "You hung the wrong woman." The notion sat heavy on him, festering in the quiet hours before dawn. He began reviewing the case files again, Mara's interrogations, the testimonies, the reports from Monroe and Pocahontas. It was all so neat, so carefully stacked, every page fitting the next like bricks in a wall. And yet the more he read, the less sense it made. Jacob Winters, Thomas Beck, Samuel Herrick, William Thorne. 4 men tied to one woman's supposed wrath, and yet one of them had died after her death. One of them, Thorne, had connections neither the sheriff nor the prosecutor had uncovered. During the trial, Whitmore traced his finger down the page listing Thorne's business dealings. Dry goods, land sales, transport contracts. But one entry stood out. A name scribbled in faded ink at the edge of the ledger. J. Winters & Co. He stared at it for a long time. "Winters," he muttered under his breath. "Jacob Winters." It couldn't be coincidence. He pulled the files on Jacob's disappearance, spreading them across his desk. The dates overlapped. Thorne's store had been taking shipments from the Winters mill 2 months before Jacob vanished. That meant Thorne knew him. Maybe more than knew him. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "So it started there," he whispered. "And maybe it never really ended." The thought chilled him. If Thorne had been part of whatever drove Mara to murder, then her story hadn't been one of madness. It had been retribution. And if Clara Winters had picked up where Mara left off, a knock came at the door. "Sheriff?" It was Pike again, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. "There's something you ought to see." Whitmore stood, straightening his jacket. "Where?" "Up near Black Hollow," Pike said. Couple of loggers found bones in the creek bed. Thought it might be deer till they saw the boots. The sheriff's stomach turned. "Boots?" "Human, sir." "And small." Within the hour, Whitmore and Pike were on horseback, the rain falling steady as breath. The trail to Black Hollow was narrow and steep, a twisting path through the heart of the forest, where fog clung low between the trees. The air smelled of wet pine and decay. The loggers waited by the water, pale-faced and silent. "Over here," one of them said, pointing to the creek where the current ran shallow. Whitmore dismounted, wading through the mud to where the rocks broke the surface. The first thing he saw was the heel of a boot, small, delicate, and old. The leather was nearly blackened from the water. Beside it, a fragment of dress fabric, frayed but unmistakably feminine. Whitmore crouched. The rain pooled around his boots, streaking the mud with dark lines. He brushed away a layer of wet leaves, and his hand froze. A skull. The curve of it was fragile, smaller than he expected, with hair still tangled near the base. He swallowed hard. Pike whispered behind him, "Good Lord." Whitmore didn't answer. His gaze shifted to the hollow under the bank. where something metallic glinted faintly through the silt. He reached in and pulled it free. It was a locket, silver, rusted shut, but engraved with a single word still visible beneath the grime, Clara. Whitmore's chest tightened. He turned it over in his hand, the weight of it both familiar and unreal. "Get the wagon," he said quietly. "We're taking her back." Pike hesitated. "Sir, if that's who I think it is—" "I know who it is," Whitmore said, his voice low. "The mountain keeps its own." They rode back in silence, the body wrapped in canvas, the locket in Whitmore's pocket. The storm had eased by the time they reached Greenvale, but the sky remained heavy, bruised with clouds. As they carried the body inside the jailhouse, Whitmore glanced at the unmarked grave through the window. Mara's grave. For months it had lain undisturbed, forgotten by all except him. Now he couldn't help but think she was still waiting for someone. When the doctor examined the remains, the truth settled like dust. The bones were female, mid-20s, likely buried for several years before the storm uncovered them. There were fractures, ribs, jaw, wrist, all showing signs of blunt trauma before death. Whitmore didn't need the doctor's verdict. He already knew. "Clara Winters," he said softly. "She never left these mountains." Pike crossed himself again. "Then who was it you saw that night, sir?" Whitmore looked up at him slowly. "That's the question, isn't it?" For the first time since Mara Dillard's hanging, the sheriff felt something close to fear. Not of ghosts or killers or justice denied, but of the mountains themselves. Because every time he thought he'd reached the end of the story, the land seemed to open one more grave to prove him wrong. Outside, thunder rolled once again, far off but moving closer. And deep in the forest, where fog never lifted and roots twisted like bones, something unseen watched and waited. Night fell fast over Greenvale that evening. The air had a strange stillness to it, heavy and thick, as though the entire valley were holding its breath. The lamps in the sheriff's office burned low, their light barely cutting through the dark. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the scent of it still hung in the wood, and earth, damp and lingering. Sheriff Whitmore sat at his desk, the silver locket before him. He had cleaned it carefully, scraping away the corrosion with the edge of his knife, until the engraving gleamed once more. Clara. There was no mistaking it now. The same name he had seen in the photograph with William Thorne. The same woman he had spoken to, or thought he had spoken to, only nights ago. But the facts refused to fit neatly together. Clara Winters was dead. She had been dead for years, long before Mara Dillard ever met her brother Jacob. And yet, he had seen her. He had heard her voice in the fog, felt her presence like breath against his skin. He rubbed his temples, his mind racing in slow, tired circles. The story had become something tangled beyond law and logic. There were too many graves, too many ghosts, and too many truths fighting to be believed. A knock broke the silence. "Come in," Whitmore said. Deputy Pike stepped inside, hat in hand, eyes uneasy. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." Whitmore frowned. "At this hour?" "It's a woman," Pike said. "Says she knew Mara. Says she came from over the ridge in Pocahontas County." The sheriff's chair creaked as he stood. "Send her in." Pike nodded and disappeared down the hall. A moment later, a figure stepped through the doorway. She was young, perhaps 20, no more, with a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were gray but not cold. Tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. "Evening, Sheriff," she said softly. "My name's Eleanor Grady." Whitmore gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Miss Grady. You said you knew Mara Dillard." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Not well, but enough to know she wasn't the monster they made her out to be." Whitmore leaned forward, his tone measured. "Then what was she?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the locket on the desk. "A woman who kept her word," she said. The sheriff followed her eyes. "You recognize this?" She nodded slowly. "That belonged to Clara Winters. Mara used to wear it sometimes. Said it reminded her of a promise." "What kind of promise?" Eleanor's hands tightened around her shawl. "The kind you don't break. The kind you bury." Whitmore felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You're going to have to be clearer than that, Miss Grady." She looked at him then, and there was something haunted in her expression, a memory that hurt to touch. before Mara ever met those men, the ones who died. She worked for a family near the border, a merchant's house. That's where she met Clara. The two of them were friends. Sisters, almost. Clara told Mara everything about her brother, Jacob Winters. What he'd done to a girl out in Pocahontas, what he'd buried in those woods. Mara swore she'd make him pay for it. And she did. Whitmore's pulse quickened. And after that? After that, they both disappeared for a while, Eleanor said. When Clara came back, she wasn't the same. Said Mara had changed too. Said she'd started keeping lists, names, places, all men. All of them connected somehow to what happened to that girl. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was cleansing. One by one. Whitmore sank back into his chair. A list, he murmured. Do you still have it? Eleanor hesitated, then reached into her shawl. From inside, she produced a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age. She placed it on the desk between them. The sheriff unfolded it carefully. Written in faded ink were 5 names. He read them slowly, one after another. Jacob Winters, Thomas Beck, Samuel Herrick, William Thorne, and below them the last name, Isaac Whitmore. The sheriff froze. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. He looked up sharply. What kind of joke is this? Eleanor didn't flinch. No joke, Sheriff. She didn't even know me until... He stopped himself. Eleanor's voice was quiet but steady. She knew all of you. Every one of those men had something in common. You all turned away from her when she came asking for help. Whitmore's throat went dry. Help with what? With Clara, Eleanor said. She went to the law first before the killings ever started. Told them what Jacob had done to that girl. They laughed. Said there was no proof, that mountain men didn't confess, and women didn't count, so she stopped asking. She leaned forward, her eyes burning now. You were one of the deputies back then, weren't you? Greenvale, 1879? Whitmore stared at her. He remembered. A young woman in the rain, mud on her hem, voice shaking as she spoke of her friend gone missing in the woods. He'd written it off as hysteria, a runaway, a love affair gone bad. He'd told her to go home. Eleanor rose from her chair. Mara kept her promise, Sheriff. She said every man who turned his back on her would answer for it. Maybe she didn't live to see it through, but the mountain did. She walked toward the door. Whitmore's voice cracked behind her. Where are you going? Back where it started, she said. To finish what's left. The door closed softly behind her. Whitmore sat motionless for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands. His name on the list seemed to pulse under the lamplight, as if alive. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then he reached for his gun. The rain began again outside, light and steady. The kind of rain that never really stopped in Appalachia. The kind that washed but never cleansed. And somewhere far beyond town, the mountains stirred, as though listening. The rain didn't stop. It followed Sheriff Whitmore through the night like a second shadow. The roads out of Greenvale had turned to rivers of mud, and the wind carried the low groan of thunder rolling through the ridges. His horse fought against the weather, hooves slipping on the slick earth, but he urged it forward, up toward the northern pass, toward Pocahontas County, where Eleanor Grady had said she was going. The folded paper in his coat pocket felt like it weighed more than lead. Every few minutes he found himself reaching for it, just to make sure it was still there. Isaac Whitmore, his own name written in a dead woman's hand. The lantern tied to his saddle swayed with each stride, casting long, fractured shadows over the mist. For the first time in years, Whitmore felt small against the immensity of the mountains, not a keeper of order, not a man of law, but just another name the valley could swallow. He rode through the dark until the trail narrowed into a ridge path that twisted. Between 2 steep drops, the wind howled through the pines like something alive. Ahead, faint through the fog, he saw it. A small cabin, its roof caved in on one side, a wisp of smoke rising weakly from its chimney. He dismounted, gun drawn, and approached slowly. The door hung open, creaking against its hinges. Inside, the smell of damp wood and decay was thick. "Eleanor," he called. "It's Sheriff Whitmore." No answer. Only the sound of rain dripping through the holes in the roof. He stepped inside, boots sinking into the soft, rotted floor. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, old, cloudy glass filled with preserved roots, twigs and water so dark it looked like ink. A table sat near the hearth, its surface covered in old papers, letters, and something else, small trinkets laid out in a neat line. A wedding ring, a belt buckle, a broken comb, and at the end of the row, a tarnished badge. His badge. Whitmore froze. He picked it up slowly, his reflection flickering in the dented brass. His heart began to hammer. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. "Put it down, Sheriff," said a voice. He turned slowly. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her shawl gone, her dress soaked through. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes cold and clear. She wasn't the frightened woman from the jailhouse. She looked older now, harder. "You followed me," she said. "You left me no choice," he replied. Eleanor stepped inside, the lantern light trembling across her face. "Then you already know why I'm here." Whitmore raised his gun, though his hand wasn't steady. "You think this is justice?" She tilted her head. "Justice." She let the word linger in the air, tasting it like poison. "No, this is remembrance." She took a slow step forward. "You could have stopped it, Sheriff. You could have believed her. The girl who came crying to you that winter. You sent her home. Do you even remember her name?" Whitmore's throat tightened. "It was years ago. It was Lydia Beck," she said. "Jacob Winter's wife. The first one. The one he buried under the sawmill floor before he ran. Clara found her. Mara avenged her. And you did nothing." He felt the words hit like a blow. "That's not true. You wrote the report yourself," she said. "You called it an accident." He hesitated. He could still see the page. The neat, practiced handwriting, the ink barely dry. Drowned near the creek, no sign of foul play. He'd written those words himself, though he'd known better. He'd been young then, still learning the ways of men in power, men like Jacob Winters, men like Thorne, who made sure the law bent around their boots. "You were part of it," Eleanor said softly. "Every man on that list was. Maybe you didn't hold the shovel, but you helped dig the hole." Whitmore lowered his gun slightly. "So what now? You kill me too?" "You'll hang for it." She smiled faintly. So did Mara. The fire in the hearth cracked sharply. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped against the broken roof, steady and patient. Then Eleanor reached into her pocket and pulled something out. A locket, identical to the one Whitmore carried. She opened it. Inside was a small, faded photograph. Mara and Clara, standing side by side, smiling faintly at the camera. Behind them, the ridge loomed high and gray. "She was my sister," Eleanor said quietly. "Clara, the one you found in the creek." Whitmore's breath caught. "Your sister—" She believed in Mara, followed her, helped her, until the men found them both. Eleanor's voice trembled now, not from fear, but from something deeper. "They didn't kill Mara that night. She got away. But Clara didn't. When I found her, she was buried shallow. I dug her up myself." Whitmore's grip on the gun faltered. "So you're the one who—" "Yes," she said. "I finished what they started. Thorne, Beck, Herrick, they all paid in the end. And you, Sheriff, you're the last name on that paper." He took a slow step back, raising the gun again. "Don't do this." Eleanor's eyes softened. "You think I came here to kill you?" She took another step forward, her hand trembling slightly. "I came here to end it." She dropped the locket on the table beside his badge. "You're the only one left who remembers how it began. When they write it down, make sure they get it right." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "And what's the truth, Eleanor?" "That the mountain never wanted blood," she said. "It only wanted witness." Before he could respond, a thunderclap split the air. The lantern flickered, then died, plunging the cabin into near darkness. When Whitmore relit it seconds later, Eleanor Grady was gone. The door stood open, the storm roaring beyond it. He stepped out into the rain, calling her name. But there was nothing. Only the sound of the wind and the rushing creek below. When he looked back inside, his eyes fell again on the table. The badge, the locket, the photograph. But the paper, the one with the names, was gone. He stared at the empty space for a long moment, then whispered, "Then let the mountain keep it." Outside, lightning flashed across the ridges, illuminating the valley below, endless, ancient, and watching. And somewhere in that storm, a voice seemed to echo, faint but unmistakable. "Balance, Sheriff. Always balance. By the time dawn crept across the ridges, Sheriff Whitmore had become a ghost of himself. His clothes were soaked through, his boots heavy with mud, and his eyes hollow from a night of chasing echoes through the storm. The fire in his gut that had once driven him, the relentless need to uncover, to prove, to punish, had cooled to something quieter, something like dread. He returned to Greenvale as the church bell rang 7 times. The streets were empty. Even the crows stayed away that morning. When he reached the jailhouse, Pike was waiting, hat in hand, worry written all over his face. "Sir," Pike began cautiously, "folks are talking again." "About what?" Whitmore's voice was rough, gravel from exhaustion. "They say they've seen her. The young one from the other night, the Grady woman, down by the ravine where Herrick was found. Said she was standing there before sunrise barefoot in the mud." Whitmore's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. "Get the men," he said. "We're going back to Hollow Ridge." Pike hesitated. "Begging your pardon, Sheriff, but if she's gone, like you said—" "She's not gone," Whitmore interrupted. "Not until I see her grave myself." The ride was slow and wet. The rain had turned to mist again, soft and steady, filling the hollows and clinging to the branches like cobwebs. By the time they reached the ridge, the morning light had dimmed to a dull silver. Hollow Ridge looked different now. The ravine that had once been a pit of secrets was half collapsed from the spring floods. Roots hung exposed, tangled like knotted ropes. The earth smelled raw, newly opened. Whitmore dismounted and motioned for the others to stay back. He moved alone through the fog, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The spot where they had found Herrick was nearly gone, washed smooth by months of rain. But there, just above the curve of the ravine, something caught his eye. A wooden cross, roughly made, nailed from 2 branches, half buried in the mud. No name carved, no markings, but fresh. The wood still smelled of sap. He knelt beside it. The earth beneath was soft, too soft. Someone had been here recently. He looked up toward the trees. "Eleanor," he called. "If you're out there, come out now." His voice carried through the hollow, then died against the wet stone walls. Nothing moved but the fog. He began to dig. His hands tore through the wet soil until his fingers hit something solid, cloth, then rope. Then beneath it, skin cold as stone. Whitmore stopped breathing. The face that stared back at him was pale, its features slackened by death. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Eleanor Grady. She'd been buried shallow. Her hair matted against her face. Her hands folded neatly on her chest. No wounds, no blood, just the calm stillness of someone who'd gone willingly. Pike and the others came running when they heard the sheriff shout. "Good God," one of them whispered. Whitmore knelt motionless, his hands trembling. "She's only been dead a day," he said softly. Pike looked around uneasily. "Then who buried her?" The sheriff didn't answer. He reached for the locket still hanging from her neck and opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was the same photograph, Mara and Clara, but now a third face had been drawn, in ink beside them. His. Whitmore felt something cold crawl up his spine. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew it would end here." He rose slowly, staring into the fog that blanketed the ravine. For a long time he said nothing. The wind moved through the pines, low and steady like breath. Finally, he spoke. "Bury her beside them." The men hesitated. "Sir? Beside Mara? Beside Clara? The mountain's been keeping its own for long enough." They obeyed without question. By midday, the graves were filled. 3 mounds of fresh earth, side by side beneath the pines. The rain started again, just as the last shovel hit the ground. Whitmore stood over the graves, hat in hand, the mud sucking at his boots. He felt the world press close around him, quiet and watching. He turned to Pike. "Tell the judge the case is closed." Pike blinked. "Closed, sir? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that justice was never ours to begin with." They left Hollow Ridge before dusk. Whitmore didn't look back, though he could feel the weight of the valley behind him. The 3 graves like eyes staring from the earth. That night, as the storm gathered again over Greenvale, he sat alone in his office, staring at the locket on the desk. The photograph had begun to fade, the ink bleeding at the edges. But even through the blurring lines, the 3 faces remained, Mara, Clara, Eleanor. He realized then what they had done. The mountain hadn't taken them. They had given themselves to it, not as victims but as witnesses. Their story, buried in soil and silence, had found its end, or perhaps its beginning. Because when he finally looked up from the photograph, he saw something outside his window that made his blood run cold. Footprints, fresh, bare, leading away from the jailhouse door toward the woods beyond. And next to them, pressed deep into the mud, was another set, smaller, lighter. A child's. Whitmore stood slowly. The lamp flickered in his hand as he walked to the door, opened it and stepped into the rain. The prints glistened faintly in the lantern light, vanishing into the fog at the edge of the trees. He followed them until they disappeared completely. Then he whispered to the silence, "Who else did you keep?" The wind rose, carrying with it a faint sound that might have been the echo of laughter, or crying, or both. And from somewhere deep within the valley, the mountain answered with thunder. The storm worsened through the night, and Greenvale trembled under it. The rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, hammering the rooftops, turning every dirt road into a river of black. The sky above the ridges was alive with lightning, white scars cutting across the clouds, and each flash illuminated the same haunted truth. The mountain wasn't finished. Sheriff Whitmore barely slept. He sat by his window, lantern dim, watching the rain streak down the glass in crooked trails. The footprints he'd seen outside his office haunted him worse than any memory. He had followed them until they vanished near the tree line. But there had been no sign of life, no movement, no sound but the wind through the leaves. And yet they were fresh. That single fact gnawed at him like a slow fever. At first light, he put on his coat and hat, holstered his revolver, and stepped out into the storm-soaked dawn. The town was eerily quiet. Even the blacksmith's forge, which usually smoked by sunrise, was cold. The people of Greenvale had learned what silence meant in the hills. It meant respect, or fear, or both. Whitmore mounted his horse and rode west, following the ridge road toward the woods beyond Hollow Creek. The air smelled of wet pine and iron, and every few minutes he thought he heard footsteps behind him. Though each time he turned, there was nothing but mist. After an hour, the trail narrowed. Branches clawed at his coat as he pushed deeper into the valley where no one went anymore. The fog here was thicker, rolling low over the ground like breath from an unseen mouth. Then he saw it. The footprints again, small, bare, clear as daylight in the mud ahead of him, weaving between the trees. The same ones from the jailhouse. They led downhill toward the place where Hollow Ridge met the river. Whitmore dismounted and followed on foot, his boots sinking into the soaked ground. His heart pounded harder with each step. The forest was utterly still, the kind of silence that made every sound, every drop, every twig crack, feel deliberate. The prince stopped suddenly at the base of a tall pine. At first, he thought the trail had simply washed out. But when he raised his lantern, he saw something carved into the bark of the tree. Letters, uneven and trembling, as though cut in haste. Balance. The word was fresh. The sap still wept from the grooves. He took a step back. The wind stirred, whispering through the branches above, and somewhere deeper in the woods, something creaked, slow, rhythmic, like a door swaying on its hinges. Whitmore followed the sound. It led him through the trees to a small clearing where the fog hung like smoke over an old well, stone rim broken, moss thick along its edge. The creaking came from the wooden pulley that still clung to the beam above, turning lazily in the wind. The sheriff knelt beside the well and peered into the darkness below. He couldn't see the bottom, only black water. Then he saw it, just for a moment, a shape beneath the surface, pale, motionless. He dropped the lantern, the flame flickering as it fell, and in that brief burst of light, he saw a face staring up from the water. A child. The sheriff recoiled, his stomach twisting. He fumbled for the rope tied to the beam and began pulling, hand over hand until something heavy broke the surface. The water spilled over the rim dark as ink. It was a body, small, fragile, wrapped in a torn blanket. He laid it gently on the ground. The face was pale, lips blue, eyes half open as though frozen mid-dream. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her hands were folded, clutching a dried sprig of pine needles bound with twine. Whitmore felt his knees weaken. "Dear God," he whispered, Pike arrived minutes later, breathless from the ride. "Sheriff, we saw your light. What in hell?" He stopped cold when he saw the body. The sheriff's voice was low and steady, though his hands shook. "She's been down there a while. Weeks, maybe months. But that's not what's wrong." Pike swallowed hard. "Then what, sir?" Whitmore pointed to the blanket. Stitched crudely into the fabric, with black thread that had begun to unravel, were 2 letters, M.D. Pike took a step back. "Mara Dillard." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Or someone who wanted us to think so. They buried the child near the others at Hollow Ridge before sunset." Whitmore oversaw it himself. As the last shovelful of dirt hit the mound, the sky broke open again, lightning streaking across the valley like veins of fire. He stood there long after the others left, the rain washing the mud from his boots, his face cold and pale beneath his hat. He didn't know who the child was. Maybe Mara's daughter. Maybe Clara's. Maybe the mountain's final secret. All he knew was that every grave in Hollow Ridge had been dug by human hands, but none of them had ever truly belonged to the living. When he returned to town, night had already fallen. His office felt different now, emptier somehow, though nothing had changed. The locket still sat on his desk. The photograph faded almost to white. Only faint outlines remained, 3 women, and something small between them that might have once been a child. He stared at it for a long time, then took the photograph out and turned it over. On the back, in faint handwriting he had never noticed before, were 6 words. "We were never 3. We were 4. He dropped the photo, his pulse thundering. Outside, the church bell rang once, long and low. And in that moment, he understood what Mara Dillard had meant all along. The mountain didn't just keep secrets. It kept bloodlines. Whitmore reached for his gun. He didn't know if he meant to defend himself or finally surrender. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the door. He turned toward the sound, hand hovering over his revolver. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. He stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Rain dripped from the eaves outside. He reached for the handle, paused, and opened the door. The lantern light fell across the porch, illuminating a small shape standing in the rain. A little girl, barefoot, soaked, silent. Her eyes were gray, her hair black as coal, and in her hand she held a pine sprig tied with twine. Whitmore's voice broke. "What's your name, child?" The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "Mara," she said. The sheriff's breath caught, and before he could speak again, she turned and walked into the fog. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew exactly where she was going. Back to Hollow Ridge, back to the mountain, where the story would never end.